Cool. Thanks everybody for jumping on. We're going to be going through Breaking the Plateau, the masterclass today. So we are going to be following along the PDF. So once again, if you haven't, I just dropped it in chat for everybody being on. If for those who are watching it, just let me know. You should have it in the link. So we're going to be going over this just kind of step by step to really make sure. So we're talking about breaking the plateau, which is really going to be a lot about, three kind of key concepts that we're going to go over, which is one, like, are we actually in a plateau? Are we really doing the things that we're doing? Like, do we know what's actually happening? Blind spots that could lead to being in a false plateau, which is a really, really common thing. And then the last one, like actually making these kind of changes. So the first thing we want to kind of ask yourselves is, how do we actually know we're in a plateau? And this is kind of a really simple thing, right? Like a lot of times, like there's somebody who was just in the Facebook group who's like, I'm in a plateau. I haven't really lost any weight for like a week or two. And in a week or two, it's kind of hard to see. Usually with a plateau, like a week or two could easily be menses. It could just be that like we went to a party a couple times. We've had some really odd measures and weigh-ins, things kind of like that. So it's really kind of hard to see in certain things. So I just kind of gave some general guidance. For weight loss, usually about a week to 2 weeks is enough to see what's kind of going on, at least for weight loss, especially if we're doing a frequent weigh-in. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. So and we'll talk about like how we track these things in a hot second. For strength, we're probably talking something a little bit longer, like 2 to 3 months, if that makes sense. So if you're trying to push like limits and you're really trying to get stronger and it's been a couple months, that's when you're probably reached a plateau. I'm not necessarily setting a PR every single time, but just a general increase. And then weight and muscle gain, this is a little trickier. We want a longer time frame on this, just simply because of how long it takes you to actually build muscle. Now, beginners on strength, we're literally like every single time. Usually beginners, these metrics are going to be much, much faster. Like a person, like a beginner in strength, we can climb quite a bit with strength at least. So what should you track? This is really important because one of the things I think that people are in, they think they're in a plateau. Zoom in a little bit. People think they're in a plateau when they're really not. And some of the stuff is you're not tracking the right data, if that makes sense. And this is really important because we need to know what's going on with what's happening. And there's definitely a time for people to not track. So certain things, if you're going to do your body weight, one of the best ways to do this is a weekly average. Not like, while we do a lot of day-to-day stuff, and 100% your body weight's going to fluctuate day to day, but a weekly average is a really good idea of what's going on, because when we do, the longer timeline we strap, like the longer the time frame that we strap out like your body weight, the more accurate it becomes, if that makes sense. Like there'll be some high days, there'll be some low days, but if we average those out, we get a really good idea of what's actually happening and what your average is. And doing a weekly average is like from like, Monday to Monday or whatever, is going to give you a really good idea of what's going on. Now, if you do that, obviously a once a week weigh-in is not going to kind of cut it. When you do once a week, you might weigh in, like, especially if you're a lady on this, you can easily catch your weigh-in on a menses. If you had just a weird day the day before, or a lot of stress or lack of sleep, all those things affect your body weight. So tracking other things outside of that are going to be huge, like circumferences. If you're going to do, I 100% recommend at least do your waist. With our clients, we do 2. We literally just do waist and hip, and we're able to get people, some of our clients who are pretty lean, we're able to get them into pretty low body composition. But the thing is if we're looking at your waist, and the reason why the waist is, all of the other areas of your body are pretty susceptible to muscle growth, with the exception of probably your waist and your neck, if that makes sense. Your waist basically is just organ, and your muscle that's on there, like your actual like core muscles, are built like plywood, and they don't have a large ability to grow. So all the weight circumference change that we're going to see is pretty much like fat tissue, if that makes sense. So especially, it's a good metric that when you're gaining weight, we're trying to see a little bit increase here, if none. If you're losing weight, we're trying to see that at least if this number is going down in tandem with weight, or just going down in general, even if the body weight is the same, that's a really, really good outcome. So circumferences. Body fat's a little bit trickier because some people don't have a scale. Some scales are designed by hydration status. It can be a little finicky, but as long as we're kind of doing this, I don't always recommend everybody to do this, just because they may not have access to it. It's very easy for somebody to have access to a scale and a circumference measurement. It's very tricky for everybody to have access to a reliable body fat reading. Always with this stuff, take it with a grain of salt. Like if you're actually at whatever it says is a lot less relevant to looking at trends, if that makes sense. So don't worry too much about this. Progress photos, usually you can do them weekly. I usually have clients do them monthly because usually it takes a little while to see change, if that makes sense. And then as a quick tip, the bigger you are, the less you'll see per photo, if that makes sense. If you're a large person, you need to see larger results for it to translate into the visual change. When somebody is already pretty lean, and if they lose like 1 to 2%, it's a drastic difference because that little 1% loss shows more muscle, if that makes sense. When somebody's larger, 1% loss may not show much different. So there's an illusion to it. So, which is why like you'll see a drastic change in photos when somebody loses like 30, 40, 50 pounds. But then once they get lean, like 1% difference is a pretty big difference to them. But it's also like the leaner you are, 1% difference is significantly proportionally a higher change, if that makes sense, just because there's not as much fat. Other things that we should be aware of too when we're talking about plateaus, how you're feeling, strength, performance, energy levels, and your overall confidence. These are things that are like day-to-day stuff that I don't think we always kind of think about, but they're always really, really important to what's kind of going on. Because when we talk about like what your goal is, unless you're talking about performance, we're really talking about feeling better and looking better and having better energy for most people. So what I mean by that is like if you're a parent and you just want to be around your kids longer, play with them, energy levels and how you feel are much more important than necessarily your weight. I think a lot of times we put the indirect result in that. Like we assume that weight loss will lead to one of these things, better energy levels, how you feel, both physically, how you feel, and emotionally, how you feel, right? So just some things to be aware of. Any kind of questions on like tracking from anybody in here? This is kind of an important thing because we need to know, like, one of the things I think that I see in terms of plateaus with people is they only track one thing. And if we don't have a good breadth of information to see what's actually going on, it can be very difficult to see what's actually happening. Does that make sense to everybody? I know you guys can't, you'd have to jump off. So other than that, so measurements, couple of things. This is the big bulk of this though, is there's 3 things that are going to go wrong with a plan. And this is where we're talking about plateaus. The first one being, we're not doing the things we're supposed to do. This is the easiest to solve, right? When I used to own a studio, we did a nutrition class one day. And I remember there was a lady who was there and she was talking to us about, she's like, I'm just not seeing any kind of results. And as we were kind of digging into what was going on, we found out that she just wasn't weighing her foods anymore. She wasn't really doing, like, she wanted to do some cardio, but she started slacking on that just because I shouldn't say it like that, but she just wasn't doing it as much because she had new obligations at work. So the easiest way, and this is the first layup, a lot of people are in a plateau because they're not doing the things that they set out to do, right? And this doesn't mean you're a bad person. It just means that there's probably stuff going on in your life, right, that's making it so you can't do this. Another one is you're unaware that you're not following the plan. And this is actually probably the trickiest to figure out. And this is what we talk about, blind spots. A common thing that happens with people, and it's not that people are lying, we're just not always aware of all the things and our actions that we're doing. And it's very common for people to be doing things that they just don't know they're doing, if that makes sense. So somebody can easily think they are doing what they're supposed to, but deep down, when we look at certain things, things aren't necessarily aligned. We'll talk about that in a little bit. This one is kind of tricky to go over just because we're blind to our own actions oftentimes. So and then the last one, the plan needs to be adjusting, right? So usually when we're trying to figure out, and if you're in a plateau, easiest thing you can do is, are you actually doing what you set out to do, if that makes sense? And if you're like, yes, I am, hitting my calories, we call it a threshold of like 80%. If you're doing what you're supposed to be doing 80% of the time, you're fine. Like, don't worry about it too much. You shouldn't have to be 100% to see results. That's a really, really important thing. If you have to be 100% perfect to see results, the plan sucks. And that's another thing. Like, there should be some wiggle room overall, unless we're talking like you're trying to be an Olympian, right? So as we're kind of talking about, are you doing the things? This is just low adherence is really what it is. But low adherence can come from things being either too difficult or too advanced. So like if I were to give somebody if somebody's in here and all they want to do is lose a little bit of weight, right? But I give them the plan that Mr. Olympia has in terms of following a nutrition plan, 20 hours of cardio a week, 10 hours of weight, whatever it is, like it's going to be way too difficult for somebody to do. And we see this happen all the time. This is a really common thing that happens with like just New Year's resolution people, right? Like they come in and they want to do everything super, super hard. They do it for a week and then they fall off, right? And now that we may look at that and be like, that's not a plateau because that's an extreme example, but it needs to be understood that like the plan should be something that you can follow that's appropriate to you and to move you forward. And we slowly make the plan more challenging to keep you moving forward, not giant increases of difficulty, but slowly what we'd be calling stretching your abilities. So that happens a lot. The other thing that happens is just life comes up flat out, right? Like if you have a kid, like it's going to be real. Like if you just have a newborn, it's going to be really hard to follow a plan. There's going to be cyclical aspects to everybody's work, if that makes sense. So like, or just life. So certain times of the year, things might be a little bit harder to do, might be harder to follow. And those are all things that we should be aware of as we're kind of going through this. So be aware of some of that stuff. This doesn't mean you're a bad person, but if you're in an accidental maintenance phase, it's probably because of this, which is a lot of people. So ask yourself first and foremost, like, are you actually doing everything you should? And one of the things I like to do with this when it comes to low adherence is, and I just talked about this. So yeah, the plan is too difficult. Complacency, which is like, we just kind of, this is a really common one for people when they start getting results. They slowly stop measuring things. They slowly eat out a little bit more often. And this is kind of justifying what's going on, if that makes sense. We're like, you're getting great results. You're like, I can get away with a little bit of a candy bar. And then, that happens for a week. And then you're like, I don't have to push as much cardio. You know what? I have a pretty good idea of what my food is. I'm going to weigh a little bit less. This complacency on this is a really common one. So I'd always encourage that when people are in a plateau to just go back to this first step and just verify they're doing the things you're supposed to be doing, right? Go back to weighing themselves, going back to tracking, going back to just kind of collecting that data and doing that stuff, and then watch what happens from there. And then life happens. This doesn't mean it's a bad thing, but if the plan is too difficult, the answer is to usually scale the plan back a little bit to move forward. So, and especially if life's going on, things are crazy, scale things down a little bit into a maintenance phase for a little while, so we can kind of move you forward. Any questions on this first one of like just doing the things and kind of complacency and stuff like that? If not, we'll just kind of zip through it. You can always just unmute yourself and ask a question if you need to. So the next one, blind spots, right? So the question is, are you doing the things you're supposed to? And my joke here is, yes, I'm doing them, but no, I'm really not. And this is a really common one. Blind spots happen to all of us. And there's going to be several things that it leads to, right? And usually, I'll talk about that quote in a second. But so there's 5 main blind spots, what they call BLTS. So BLTs, which stands for bites, licks, tastes, and snacks, and then parentheses, drinks. So these are things that you're going through your day and you're just eating a little bit more food than you're not aware of, and it scales up pretty quick. A really common one with this we had is like parents. So usually when we talk about like people who've had like one of the things I've noticed with parents is like they'll kind of say like, oh, after my first child, I can usually lose the weight. But a common thing I've heard from a lot of parents is like after my second, third, or even fourth child, it becomes increasingly more difficult. And like, because the more kids you have, the more obligations that kind of come up. But one of those things is the parents tend to finish their kids' food. They tend to taste a little bit more, partake in it a little bit more. And that's not a bad thing, but you have to be aware that it's going on. This is typically something that's unregistered in terms of like eating, if that makes sense. Measuring is a huge one. This usually happens with people guesstimating what's going on. So they think they are tracking everything, but in reality there's a lot more guesstimations of what are going on. Low effort training is a really common thing. People just aren't, this doesn't mean you have to go so hard you kill yourself every workout, but things need to be challenging enough to get a stimulus. And when we're talking about doing the training, something that happens, we're not saying this with everybody, but like they're just not pushing it as much as they probably should. I just realized that numbering's out of order. Inconsistency. This is a common thing. So when I was at my studio, we had a lady who was like, I'm hitting my protein 130 grams every single day. And we're like, okay, cool. Let's take a look at your weekly average. And if you don't know, MyFitnessPal has an actual way to look at your weekly of average on like what your calories were, what your protein was. And when we zoomed out and took a look at her week, while there was days she would hit 130 grams, her weekly average was much more in the 90s. And it's a really common thing for somebody to hit something 2 or 3 days a week and then go, I'm doing it every day. right? But once again, we're blind to our own actions. So this comes up quite a bit. I've been eating unknown amounts frequently. This is another really, really common one. If you're going out to eat probably 3 or 4 times a week, even if you feel like what you're ordering is great, there's a good chance that those things, there's errors in measurements, there's errors in like what the reportings are in MyFitnessPal, there's errors in even what they do at the and how much they give you at the actual like restaurant. This adds up really, really fast. This doesn't mean you shouldn't eat at a restaurant ever. It's just we want to limit it, because the more opportunities there have for variability, that variability adds up pretty quick. So usually we kind of tell people if they're going out to eat like usually over 2 times a week, that's when we start seeing things kind of go awry, especially when they're in a plateau. So we try to say, hey, try to reel it into at least like twice a week if possible. Cook some stuff on your own, maybe eat something that's a little bit more consistent. Like, and this is kind of sounds weird, but fast food is definitely going to be much more consistent in what they give you than a restaurant is in terms of like ordering and how much is actually reported on like the menu. The errors, and this is actually a crazy statistic, the calorie amount at restaurants can be off by about 40%, which is wild to think about. At like fast food, it's between like 10 and 20% from what they say on the menu, which is pretty wild. So once again, try to limit it down. So these are kind of a couple things that are going on. So once again, BLTS, bites like say snacks, measuring your food, low effort training, just inconsistency in general that we think we're far more consistent than we are, and then eating unknown amounts pretty frequently. Any kind of questions on these? Cool. This is really straightforward. Obviously, these are the 2 big ones we talk about. Like when people think they're in a plateau, it's a lot of times it's these first 2 things, because we're not pushing like physiological limits yet. So low adherence, as I talked about, or just like we're not following the plan, just get back to doing that. Double check for your blind spots, which is a huge thing, right? Just be aware what's going on. First check this, bites, licks, taste, snacks, anything that you eat and drinks, record it, measuring, get back to that. Make sure we're just putting enough oomph in the gym. That doesn't mean kill yourself. It just means like push it a bit, right? Inconsistency, verify that you're doing what you need to be doing. And what I say with inconsistency, what I really mean is like if you're doing 3 or 4 days out of 7, I'd probably say that's inconsistent. If you're doing it 5 or 6 days out of the week, I'm like, that's probably good enough, if that makes sense, within some reason. So we're not saying every single day, we're all humans. Don't be like obsessed with being perfect. But if you should be doing like 80 to 90% of the time, you're going to be superstar, if that makes sense. And then unknown eating amounts. This one tends to be a killer, especially when things get a little high, like 2 or 3 days, and especially above that 3-day mark, we're definitely going to see issues here. Which kind of brings us to this justification, right? Let's talk about justifying things. So one of the things that happens to a lot of people on this journey is as they start pushing their workouts, it's very common for people to justify like going out to eat more. So, or just eating other things in general. This is walking head first right into like maintenance phase. So an example would be like you had a hard workout and somebody goes, hey, I worked out, I burned X, Y, and Z calories. You know what? I'm feeling pretty good today. I'm going to go eat X, Y, and Z. And we see people eat back their calories quite a bit. This is why we're big advocates of not eating back your calories. But if we need to increase somebody's calories because they just need a little bit more like oomph in the gym, that's okay. We can do that. But like, we really want to be careful about things that we're justifying. So an example would be justifying not going for an extra walk today, justifying going out to eat a little bit more, right? These are just things that we do. Now, there's always days, like if you're not feeling it one day and you're beat to hell, take a rest day. Like that's okay. But we're talking like on an average, like one day here and there is not a big deal. But this is why it's so important to track and look at things from a big picture too, not just a day by day thing, which is going to go a long way. And that's actually something that's I want to point out in this is something that happens with this blind spots is one of the reasons why we're not aware of this stuff is because we're going through things in a moment by moment basis. So an example is if somebody's tracking, like we're talking about the lady with protein, like she'll track her protein sometimes, and when she tracks it, she's doing great. But there's other days, quite a few days that she wasn't doing it, right? So when we zoom out, we can see what's going on. A lot of these things are amplified with a longer time frame, but in the day by day thing, they're not that big of a deal. And that's kind of why this happens, is because we zoom out a little bit and we look at what's going on to a week to a month. And then we're like, oh yeah, this stuff is happening quite frequently, right? But we might go, hey, yeah, that 1 week you only ate out 1 time, but the next week we ate out 4 times. The week after that, we ate out 2 times. The week after that, we ate out 4 times again. And you can see how that starts to scale up, right? But like the person, when we ask them how many times are you eating out, they might go, well, I'm only going out to eat once. But then there's all these other circumstances like a birthday, a wedding, a kid's party, a promotion, right? That we justify going out to doing these things more often. And we don't notice that until we take a wider scope at what's actually happening, which is important. That's why I want to cover this first, because a lot of times somebody thinks they're in a maintenance, but there's just life happening, other things going on, and we're in an accidental maintenance phase versus like a legitimate plateau. So we have to kind of cover this first, because a lot of people, probably like 80% of people, are going to fall in these first 2 categories. But like the next one is where things really, really kind of get important. So any kind of questions before we jump on to like actual talking about like training and nutrition and getting into a little bit more like plateau stuff? Cool. I love it. I see a bunch of heads being shook, which is good. So
no, but sorry about my cat walking through.
No worries. It's all good. So the next one is the plan needs to be adjusting. It's a broken plan. Now, what is working today does not mean it'll work in a month. And that's just our body, because our bodies are these dynamic, extraordinary, really awesome, amazing things. But like what is going on today doesn't mean it'll give us results tomorrow. What I mean by tomorrow is usually like months, if that makes sense.
Come on.
So basically what we're looking at here is the plan needs to be adjusted, right? Now there's 2 typical things that we're going to look at. Either it's a really bad plan, or that you've caught up to the change. So your body adapts, you get stronger, you've lost a bunch of weight, right? Now you burn less calories. Like those are 2 really kind of common things, right? This first one we see a lot though. It's just not a good plan. And this could be just because of what I mean by it's not a good plan. Maybe it's not appropriate. As I mentioned earlier, when we have like a beginner who's never worked out and we give them a Mr. Olympia plan, right? That's an obvious issue. And we'll talk about why that's also more problematic in a little bit. So we want to make sure that the plan doesn't have as much junk and filler in it, that the training is actual purposeful, right? And granted, there's fun fitness too, and that for some reason I actually didn't even talk about that today. But mostly junk in the terms of like we're doing stuff, but it's not valuable for what's going on. And then once again, the body adapts, right? So when we talk about programming, there's a couple things that we need to go over before like we get deep into this, and that is you need enough stimulus for a good plan. So what enough stimulus means, and what we're talking about with this, is basically when you're doing your training, you need to be training enough for the body to change. Beginners don't need very much. The more advanced you become, the more it is, and the more it is, and the more it is, and the more it is. And it's important to understand that a beginner legitimately only needs 3 to 6 working sets. So what I mean is like, what I mean by 3 to 6 working sets to like see a change. If you did 1 set of really hard squats 3 days a week, that's enough for beginners to see change. But for somebody who's advanced, the range is much higher. It's 10 to 20 working sets per group per week, which means that like somebody like who's been weight training for a long time, like Matt, might want to get in, not just 1 set of bench press. He might need, as what I've seen him post a lot, is he does a 5x5. But once again, that's 5 work sets. He might need, for him to see more growth in his chest, he might need to go up to 6 work sets in a week, and then 7 work sets in a week eventually. And eventually it scales up and up and up, and that becomes obviously a foreseeable problem. Other things that are really important that we need to do is make sure you're getting enough protein in and make sure your calories are in a good place. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Sufficient difficulty. I talked a little bit about this earlier. This doesn't mean it needs to be a 10 out of 10 hard. What we mean by hard enough is usually when you're, especially when it comes to exercise, we're kind of saying this like 7 to 8 out of 10 difficulty, if that makes sense. You don't have to go to failure every time. Like there's really good evidence showing you don't have to, but like if you're just kind of doing some sets and leg pressing going through, even though you're working out and you're spending time, and there's a great benefit to simply just moving, right? When we talk about you breaking a plateau though, we need to make sure there's sufficient level of difficulty in the exercise. Otherwise, you're not going to push through. And I'll talk much more about this in a bit. And then once again, fitness is progressive, which means that tomorrow you need a little bit more. And then the day after that, you need a little bit more, right? Now, not on that fast of a time frame. Usually it's like month by month by month, but we see this with nutrition too. As your body changes, as you get leaner, we need to constantly bigger stimulant to what's going on. And we're going to get into all that in a little bit. So really important things that we see. A lot of times we talk about people and their weight loss. What we see is they do this instead of like moving forward. What they kind of tend to do is this random, they jump from like plan to plan, if that makes sense. So somebody might start off with tracking, but then they hit a plateau. And then from tracking, they might try intermittent fasting. And then maybe they see a little bit of change, but not really. And then they go to keto. And what they do is they plan jump, right? And I always say these are lateral movements because each one of these you do could help, but it also could put you right back to where you were. And we're not actually moving forward. So we see this happen all the time. Somebody gets stuck, and what they do is they start looking for, like, I'm just going to put this in quotes, like the next magical solution. They go like, oh man, I'm just eating, too many carbs, or I'm not doing fasting. You know what? Oh, it's because I'm eating too far at night or too early in the day, or I'm not skipping a meal or whatever it is. There's a million things that are going on, but what they're not doing is oftentimes progressively moving forward. So what I mean by that is what we want to see is a smart adjustment, which is maybe you start with tracking and you do that for a little bit and the plan stops working, right? And then we chip some calories. We do that for a while, the plan stops working. We add 20% more volume in. So like we're talking about with Matt, maybe he adds another set of bench press in. Now, instead of 5x5, it's a 6x5. And that works. Great. And then maybe it eventually stops working. And then we start adding in some more activity, right? So the goal is to move you down this continuum versus jumping laterally side to side and trying all these different things, hoping it works. Now, there's nothing wrong with intermittent fasting or keto or veganism per se, but what ends up happening, we see people jump sideways instead of actually moving forward. So instead of actually training a little bit harder or doing more training, they look for a new plan, if that makes sense. Instead of adding a little bit more activity during the day, they go, oh, you know what? I'm going to do this other thing so somebody else is going. And we see this in plan hopping, right? Now, there's definitely a time to change things up for excitement. But when we're talking about like change physiologically, we want to make sure that we're doing just a little bit more, if that makes sense, and a little bit more. So you're going to see that talk about a ton, which kind of brings us to like this stage, which is one of the most important concepts of training. And this is like, there's a few laws when it comes to training. One of these laws is what's called progressive overload. And this is important to understand. Progressive overload just means a little bit more every time, right? So I drew these little kind of charts to hopefully help out. So if you started working out, right, and you started, let's just say you start squatting with 5 pounds, you do your first workout, right, you get some change, this little graph goes up a little bit, and then you just keep doing 5 pounds, right? There's only so much your body adapts until it just flatlines. We see this with every aspect of your body. So when we see people who've come in and they'll do training, they'll be like, oh yeah, well, I'm doing curls, I do 3 sets of 10, and I use the 15s. And I'm like, well, how long have you been doing that? Because like that should only last for a certain period of time until you're doing 12 reps with the 15s and 13 reps with the 15s. And then you go to the 12 and a half. I mean, then you go to the 17 and a halfs, right? And then the 20. So the goal is to move to progress over time to keep the body slowly adapting. Because if you don't push it, your body is lazy in the sense that it doesn't want to adapt unless it needs to. And we need to give it a reason to change. So if you're always lifting the same weights every time, then we're never going to see either muscle or fat loss or strength progress. And I know this is kind of a duh statement, but we see people get into this trap of they'll do like, I do 3 sets of 10 with the 15s. And I'm like, why the 15s? And they're like, it's just what they do, right? They get into this kind of habitual thing. And we want to see things pushed how we can. It might be more reps, more weight, however we want. But this is so important because if we don't do this, we're really missing the forest from the trees. Progressive overload is one of the best things we can do, especially as beginners, is get this base level of strength and push it pretty hard initially. Eventually, though, if anybody can see a problem with this, is you can't do this forever. This only works to a certain point, right? Like you can't keep literally adding 5 pounds to your bench press from day one till, even if you did 5 pounds a week, right? 5 pounds a week over a year is 310 pounds. Like at some point it stops working, if that makes sense. Or what I mean is, sorry, it's 250 and 260 pounds. But like the thing here is that eventually stops. And the reason that stops is this next one, is what we call a sync analogy. And this is what we call the next law. This is important to understand, what's called general adaptation syndrome. Your body follows a pattern of adapting to things, right? So over here, this stress down here is not very much. But now when you're up to the 20 pounds, there's more stress on your bones, there's more stress on your tendons, it takes more effort, and all of a sudden the stress is much, much, much higher with what we call the sink analogy, right? So this is the best way I've ever heard this explained to me in terms of what's going on. So if you want to visualize a sink with the faucet having the water come down, right? And that water coming into the sink is stress. So there's a certain amount. So when stress is coming in, the harder we train, the more that faucet's turned on and the more water's coming in, right? And we have a drain at the bottom, but the drain can only drain stress so quickly. That's going to be either genetics, it's going to be just your overall level of training, if that makes sense. And eventually what happens is if there's more water coming in than what the drain can clear out, right? Stress accumulates and it accumulates and it accumulates. And eventually it overflows. So we have a tolerance for how much stress we can have. We have an ability to process that. And then there's how much stress is coming in. As you train and as you get more fit, you get a better drain and you get a bigger sink, if that makes sense. But at the same time, as we push your body forward, we have a faster faucet. That faucet is coming in quicker and quicker and quicker, right? And you might be able to outrun this for a while, but to keep pushing your body with this up and up and up, right? It's a matter of time until the sink overflows. And this is a really common thing. This is when we start either reaching, I don't want to say, well, it can be injury for some people, overtraining, or when it comes to like weight loss, where we're reaching our actual plateaus, if that makes sense. And this is where the actual plateau happens. So we increase over time, right? Bit by bit by bit. This faucet runs faster and faster and faster. Our ability to recover, while I say training affects this, it's on a very, very, very long timeline, right? Bone takes months to get stronger, not weeks like your muscle does. And so it's really important to realize that over time, the sink will start to overflow, and we have to do a couple things, right? Now, the ways, we'll talk about that in a second of like what we would do once it starts to overflow. But initially, we need to make sure there's enough water coming in for our body to actually train, like get better, right? So there's steps to progressing. So a couple things. The easiest one is adding load. So just whatever the next increment is. It can be 2.5, it can be 5 pounds. I should have brought them in here, but I actually have these little tiny weight plates. I don't know if you guys follow my stories, but I post all the time. I call them my poverty plates, where one weighs 0.5 pounds and the other one weighs 0.7 pounds. So together they weigh 1.25 pounds, which is half of the little 2.5 pound plate. So when I add these on to like whatever I'm doing, I'm literally going up by 2.5 pounds, which is like the smallest increment. But like the thing is if I'm adding 2.5 pounds every week to something, that adds up super duper 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 fast. So what I'm doing is I'm letting the stress come in, but what I'm doing is just enough to let my sink drain, if that makes sense, versus a faster kind of progressing. So the smallest increment every single time if you can. With beginners and strength, we could scale this up super duper fast. The next one is adding or chipping 50 to 100 calories. If you're looking for weight loss, we can chip a little bit of calories, right? If you're looking for like weight gain, we add a little bit. And then we just repeat. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. Adding more steps in, increasing volume. If you're trying to gain more muscle, this is huge. When it comes to like size, increasing volume is one of the most important things you can do. And what I mean by that is volume is overall sets and reps. So as I mentioned with that beginner, a beginner only needs 3 to 6 working sets in a week to see results, right? But after they get good at that, they need a little bit more. So they have to go to 7 sets, which is, roughly about a 20% increase. The reps don't matter as much here. And that's really important to understand is reps don't matter nearly as much as the overall amount of like exposure to difficult, challenging sets. There is some truth to the rep ranges, but it's big. It's like 5 to 30 reps than it is like this smaller rep range that I think we tend to hear. Adding more fitness in and just increasing recovery, right? All these things are ways to progress. That doesn't mean you have to do all of these. Usually you want to keep it simple. Usually when it's weight loss, obviously chipping a little bit of calories, increasing your activity goes a long way. And it can be a combination of these. But then I just want to kind of point out, and now there's way more than this. I think technically there's like 12 to 16 ways to technically progress, but I don't want to kind of get into this really, really micro level of that stuff. I really want to cover that. It's important that we think we need to train hard and progress, right? And then we need to understand that the more stress we put in, at some point it's going to the stress that we're doing to progress is going to overflow our ability to recover. And that's the key concept that I want to go over here. These are just ways that we can increase that stress. Questions on kind of that so far? Cool. So what do we do once the sink is full, right? Now, over time, like there's eventually will be bigger problems that we'll talk about, but this brings us into what we call deloading, which is really important. So if you've ever heard somebody in the group go like, oh, like I have a deload week. I'm a big advocate of this. I deload every 4th week. So what I mean by that is a deload is I do a little bit less stress. So we talk about this training, this example, right? So every 4th week, what I do is I lower my weights by about 30%. And I'm dead serious about this. So if I feel embarrassed when I go to the gym and I have to do this because like sometimes I'm using weights that I feel so small for myself, but like I'll bring everything down by 30%, right? Which means that there's a lot less stress coming in, and that gives my sink chance to drain. It drains down. Now, you don't necessarily need a deload if your sink's not full. So every 4th week, I do this. Now, right now, I'm like entering week 2 of my of like this next block, and I'm already a lot stronger, like with several aspects. But usually by my 4th week, by the end of my 4th week, I'm exhausted, I'm tired. I'm like, man, I don't know. I'm just kind of going to my workout just to finish it up. And then I take a week where I do it a little easier. It allows my sink to drain. And usually at the end of my deload, I'm excited to train again. I feel good. I feel fresh. I'm ready to kind of get back in and push pretty hard. So you can do what's called a planned deload, which is what I just talked about. Every 4th week I do one. You could do, this might be a little more relevant to you, Matt, where you do a load reset. So a load reset is like if you've been squatting a bajillion pounds, and let's say you've been doing it for like a month and you just can't overcome that load. Let's just say somebody's doing 100 pounds in their squat, 5 sets of 5 for 100 pounds, and they just can't get to 105. The 5 sets of 5 is just super hard. What they can do is drop the weight down for a while. So instead of 100, because the sink, there's enough stress coming in from the sink, it's overflowing. So what we do is we drop the weight down to like maybe 80 pounds, let the sink drain, and then they slowly go back to doing this, climbing back up again, if that makes sense. So I actually had to do this with my deadlift recently. Just as an example, my deadlift was I did 3 sets of 5 at 375, and for my body weight, that's pretty good. And at the end of my training block, I didn't hit a PR. I went for another single and I just couldn't get it. I was super tired. So what did I do? I went back down to 360 instead of 375, and I crushed 375. I mean, I crushed 360, and then I went to 370. 370 is not a problem. I went to 380, which is where I'm at now. 380 feels great. So it allowed me that while that 170 I set it back for about 2 months, slowly worked my way back up, and I'm already now in a higher range, if that makes sense. I gave my body an ability to recover by lowering the stimulant, if that made sense. Then by doing that, I slowly worked my way back up and I got stronger again. Pretty straightforward. And then this last one is a much bigger scope, what we'd call a reacclimation phase. And what I mean by that is we shift goals. We either bring the things down for an extended period of time, 6 to 12 weeks, or we shift goals. This is what we do with weight loss over an extended period of time. And this is actually a really important thing we'll talk about. But basically, like once somebody's lost an extended amount of weight, or they push something really, really hard for months and months and months, we want to shift gears for a little while. Now, that doesn't mean we do something totally different. It means we do something similar, but either with less stimulant and stress, or something that's a little bit more adjacent for a while. The best way you can phrase this or think about it is, if you've ever had to ride a bike up a really, really steep hill, it's very difficult to go in a straight line sometimes, if that makes sense. Sometimes it's a little easier to zigzag your way up the path. We see this with hiking, right? A path that goes from the bottom all the way up to the top in a straight line is brutal. But when there's lots of switchbacks, it makes the incline much easier. It stretches it out. So what we're kind of saying is when you're doing this reacclimatization phase, we're trying to like change the body of it, is we're like adding a switchback in, if that makes sense. We're allowing the body to kind of move adjacent, but still kind of forward and give us time to eventually switch back to it. Now, this is a little trickier, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but deloading, if you feel like you've been pushing your body, I do a planned deload every 4th week. That's just what my time frame is. A load reset a reacclimation phase. This is where we'll talk about this in a little bit. So to do that, these are these kind of phases that we think about. We either are dropping weight or gaining weight, right? We're either in a maintenance, or what we call a reverse dieting phase. We're in accumulation, which is we're slowly adding more to the system, like adding more weight, adding more volume, like we're building up, right? And then a resensitization, a reacclimation, what we're talking about, which is resensitizing your body. And this is a little bit longer. So these are these 4 things we're kind of thinking about. And the reason we have to do that, let me know if I'm going too fast or this kind of makes sense. I feel like some of this stuff is a little deep, but we kind of have to go over it, because if we don't, it's kind of hard to explain like what's happening with plateaus. So this is, when we talk about weight loss, we're going to get into this. There's compensations that happen. And this big one is what's called adaptive thermogenesis, which is basically like your body has this ability over time to lose weight. So as you start, the blue line is calories consumed. So over time, as you're losing weight, we keep chipping the calories down and down and down and down, right? And this purple line, which is your body weight, we see results, and then it starts to kind of taper off, right? And we see this happen all the time. The reason why it tapers off as you're lowering the calories is, and this kind of goes back to the sink analogy, is when there's less calories coming in, it's harder for your body to recover. And then it does certain things. Because it can't recover so much, it slowly makes it so you can't push it in the gym. So your workouts start to suffer, right? Zoom in a little bit more on this. So your workouts start to suffer. When you lower the calories a little bit more, hunger starts to kick in, right? Your activity, when you have less and less calories because you're eating less food, your body doesn't want you to move as much. So it tells you it's like, hey, chill out, like don't move as much. So you sit more, you're more sedentary. As the calories get even lower, your overall ability to follow the plan really starts to plummet. And when we talk about weight loss plateaus, this is the big thing. So when we talk about these things happening, this is really when people talk about, if you've ever heard somebody say like starvation mode, this is kind of what starvation mode is, but it takes a long time to get there. It's not your body stores weight. It's this gradual decrease in what's going on because your body slowly starts to be like, don't move as much. You're not eating very much food. Don't move as much. Let's conserve, right? It goes, hey, you're not getting enough energy in to train hard, so don't train hard. Like, don't push it. And it slowly drops this stuff down, right? If you're not eating enough, you can't train hard, just flat out, right? And all this adds up over time. The other thing that happens is over time, this red line, your metabolic weight drops. The reason for that too is a smaller body. As you lose more weight, a smaller body just burns less calories, right? So over time, you're burning less calories, you're eating less because you're trying to offset that drop. And it's basically a race to the bottom. So because you're trying to eat less to continue the weight loss, your body's losing weight and it's slowing down, and then these things start to kick in. And that's how a weight loss plateau happens, if that makes sense. So now usually, obviously, like if you're starving, literal starving, you'll just wither away and die. The issue why that doesn't happen with most people is because hunger gets to a point, or like difficulty to follow a plan gets to a point, and then your body just goes, eat like a psychopath. Like, and it'll start ramping up your hunger to a point where it's almost like unsatiable. Like it'll just, that's all you think about is food. And if you've ever been deep into a diet, you know what I'm talking about, where like you're thinking about your next meal after you just had a meal. You're like, man, that was good. I got to eat in 2 hours again. Like, I'm excited about that. And you just had your meal. And that's what happens as you get further into this plan. So what do we do with this? Like, well, this is where the phasing comes in. And this is why we want these phases, because when you have a fat loss phase, we push these things to a point, your body inevitably loses some lean body mass. And then what we want to do is have a phase where we're working on building more lean body mass, where we try to get stronger. And especially if you are a chronic dieter, I don't know if I have a thing on this, we'll talk about that in a little bit, especially if you're a chronic yo-yo dieter and you're like, man, I'm eating, and you're like eating 1,000 calories and you're not seeing results. It is so critical that you take time and build lean body mass. Over time, as you lose weight, I mentioned you lose lean body mass. Like that's, I didn't mention, but as you lose weight over time, you lose a little bit of lean body mass. And your number one indicator of your like metabolic rate is lean body mass, how much muscle you have, right? Now, we're not saying we all need to be Mr. Olympia, but when people chronic diet or yo-yo diet, like they do hardcore fasting or cleanses or anything that isn't necessarily preserving lean body mass, over time they have less lean body mass. Then they go back to their previous lifestyle of whatever they're eating. And now when you go back to that lifestyle of, let's say, eating X calories, but you have less lean body mass, you gain the weight back and then you gain more because you have a slower metabolic rate. And then you do another chronic diet and then you lose more lean body mass. And then now you have an even slower metabolic rate. And you do that over and over and over and over again. And all of a sudden we're in a place where we don't have very much lean body mass. Our metabolic rate is very low. That's not necessarily because of like chronic dieting. It's mostly from a lean body mass loss standpoint, right? And this adds up to a lot. So if you've been a chronic dieter, this is super important. What's called a reverse diet, where what we do is we bring your calories down over time. And then what we do is we get you to a place and we increase the calories down. Now, this is an actual client we did this with, which is pretty wild. So he was at, I think, 194 when he started. And when he got to his lowest, it was 147, if that makes sense. We started him at 1,800 calories. And we kept chipping to 1,700 calories, 1,650. And this whole big block right here, he just actually was only at 1,600. And sometimes the body's really amazing. It just does this. Like you make one chip and then it just goes forever, which is cool. But then once we got him to a certain point, we started adding calories back in because he just didn't, he was like, and he asked a really important question. He's like, Adrian, like, this is great and all. I feel great. I look great. But do I have to eat 1,600 calories for the rest of my life? And the answer was no. So we started adding calories in. We started with 1,700 and then went to 1,800, 1,850, 1,900, 2,000. 20, and I think actually currently as of today, he's actually at 2,350 calories. And you can see his body weight has practically not changed. It's actually sloped down a little bit, but now he's eating 2,300, which from the beginning is a significant amount more. We're actually up to, from his lowest point to his highest point, about 900 calories more than what he was. And we have a photo of him later. Are you in here? This dude. So he's lost a massive amount of weight in this period of time. And this is here in the second photo, he's actually eating more than he was in this first photo, which is a trick. But we did that because of this. We did reverse dieting, right? So what are the steps here? Well, the first one is we have to bring you up over time. And the reason I'm saying this is important for a chronic dieter is what we're trying to do when somebody's like, I'm only eating 1,000 calories, and they are actually eating 1,000 calories, not one of the very first things we talked about, right? Not up here when we talked about blind spots, and they're not following the plan, which is really, really common when we hear people eating so little. But they're actually eating that much. You need to take months. And when I mean months, I mean like 3 to 6 months, not worrying about weight loss, slowly climbing your calories back up and actually build some lean body mass. Because as I mentioned, chronic dieters don't have very much. So it's so important. And what you do is you start with an initial jump of like 250 to 500. I like smaller jumps and more frequent. So what I mean by that is I like to opt for like adding in, like you can see some of these jumps are only 50 calories. I like little jumps initially to see how the body responds. And then as you can actually see, like here, let me zoom in a little bit more so you can see what I'm talking about. So you can see it's like 50, 50, 50, but then like it starts to go down again. And I'm like, oh crap, add 100 and add 100. We start adding like hundreds in so that way we can kind of get him back on track to like where he needs to be. Because it was just clearly, even though we're adding calories, he was losing weight. So we start with an initial one. And then here you'd also bump your protein up, really, really make sure your protein's in a good place. And then what we do is initially there'll be a little bump in weight just from more food and more carbohydrates, right? And then what we do from that point is we just slowly do a weekly bump. If you're trying to gain weight, this is where you might bump up by 50 to 100 calories, which might just be 5 grams of carbs, or 10 grams of carbs or 5 grams of fat, or you can do both if you want a drastic one, which is, not drastic, but you do it over time, little by little, because we want to make sure you're not gaining very much fat, if that makes sense. Like that's the big change. So we watch how your body responds, we track your measurements. So even though we've added all this stuff back into this dude's diet, his actual waist circumference has dropped 2 centimeters over a period of time. So I put some limits on what you want to see, because you can go too quickly with scaling your calories up, but usually 50 to 100 calories a week. You can pretty much do that week over week. And then once the body starts to kind of gain the weight, you level it off for a bit, if that makes sense. So you kind of, and especially when people are chronic dieters, they're usually, like I said, they just have a really, really slow metabolic rate. Any kind of questions on this at all? This is kind of an interesting idea, and I know I'm not sure how familiar you guys are with this. Cool. The next one, sensitizing. This is where we just shift goals, right? So this is where we either are going to think like bring out your total volume down. So the reason why we can do this is what it takes for your body to get results is a lot less than what it takes your body to maintain results. So maintenance of strength and maintenance of size needs about only 60% of what you were doing to maintain it. And this is really important, which means that like if that sink is overflowing, right, and we're just exhausted, we don't need to do 100% of what we're doing to maintain it. The body can maintain muscle and strength and performance at 40% less or 60% of what you're doing, which means if you're doing 10 sets of bench press in a week, we can bring it down to 6 and your body will hold on to what it can. And that 40% drop allows the body to catch up, allows the body to recover, and allows you to push forward again, right? So the other way of doing this is we talk about shifting goals, going back to this yin yang, right? If you've been focusing on strength for a while and getting stronger, then just focus on building some muscle for a little bit. If your goal has been muscle mass for a while, focus on lowering the body fat for a little bit. And we can just go back and forth between these. Time frames are usually like 3 to 6 months at each one, if that makes sense, with a little bit of time in between them, if you want, especially when it comes to this, you want to maintain for a while. And one of the big things that we see is, once again, like when we see people who just lose weight right away, they don't have a planned maintenance phase. They lose the weight and then they just go right back to what they're doing, or they continue to keep their calories low for a period of time. But it's so important for you to have this reverse diet or this slowly bringing the calories back, right? Bulking cutting is a very similar process. I don't want to go too far into this if you guys don't have questions, but basically, what we want to do is establish your initial starting points, and then we watch how your body responds, and then we just lower or bring up the calories. This one's really, really straightforward. Usually this isn't as important. The reason why we're just kind of glossing over is this is like a starting place. Once you've started tracking your foods and everything else, then you're just off the beaten path. And we want to make sure that like you're just adding or subtracting foods and you're watching how your body responds. So what should you do? So we're pretty much at the very end of this. Step one, once again, ask yourself if you're actually doing the things you're supposed to be doing. And this is where it's so important to be brutally honest with yourself, right? Step two, verify that you don't have blind spots. So once you can verify you don't have any blind spots, everything looks good. From that point, we move to step two, which we actually have to figure out where you're at in your journey and then make those adjustments from there. Does that kind of make sense? So we go, okay, cool. Like if it's strength, then we need to keep, like, if strength's your goal and you're stuck getting stronger, I'm going to zoom out for a little bit. I'm actually going to, so if strength is your goal and you're starting to lose your strength, right? It's so important. Whoops. I don't know if that didn't work the way I wanted it to. Gallery. All right. I'll just leave it here. So if your goal is strength, right, and you keep pushing it and pushing it and pushing it, what you can do to kind of get to keep getting stronger is you start either adding in more days, which could happen. So you go from 3 days of training to 4 days of training to 5 days of training kind of thing, which is a really common with strength progression. With size, you just add volume in, which is like you just add work sets. So if you're like, man, I want to get more chest size or leg size or more size to your glutes, right? When you're doing your 6 sets, then you go to 7 sets, then to 8 sets, and then you keep adding that, right? Eventually, there's the sets and the time for the workout becomes so long that you need a new day, if that makes sense. Because eventually your workouts become hours. Like my current workout's like an hour and a half. But if I keep adding more sets to it, eventually it's going to hit 2 hours. And then it's important where I might just want to break that off and have a separate day, which is what we do with beginners. We go from 3 days of training. Once we cap that out after a while, we go to 4 days of training. Once that looks good, we go to 5 days of training, if that makes sense. And we just kind of scale up from there. So that's what we do with size. With fat loss, we keep chipping and adding more calories in. And then once you get to a place where things are a little uncomfortable, then what we do is, like I said, we shift goals. We start adding calories back in. We start gaining more lean body mass, and we take it from there. But we don't need to do it until like either they're at a place where they're like, I feel great and I'm ready to kind of do this next step, or we're pushing a place where that sink is overflowing and they're just like, I don't want to do this anymore, right? And if you've ever done like a really deep cut and got really a deep diet or got super lean, you know what that feeling is like. It's like this exhaustion. You're just like, I don't want to do this anymore. So that's where we kind of shift goals. So that covers quite a bit of stuff. Anybody have any, I know this probably went through a lot, but anybody have any questions on any of this so far? Cool. Does this answer a lot of anybody's kind of questions or anything else for anybody? Is this really helpful? Cool. So there were a couple questions. Somebody asked, Nicole, if you have a question, let me know. There's some questions in the initial guide. Somebody asked about set point theory. So this is actually a really good one. So set point theory is this idea that your body has this place that it wants to get to, right? There's not as much, like, what I mean by that is if you've ever been at an acclimated weight for like a year, right? That's kind of what set point theory is, or what it's hypothesized as. So if you've ever been like, I've just been 190 pounds for like my entire life, and that's what it's been, right? That's kind of where set point theory comes in. But it's not necessarily true. That's more of like your weight as like a byproduct of one, genetics, and two, your lifestyle, right? So if you have this lifestyle that just lets you live at 190 pounds, you just live your lifestyle, and that's 190 pounds, right? The average American, though, gains like 5 pounds a year over year, and just never loses it. And this is important to know, when they gain weight is in two spots. They gain weight over the weekends and from holidays. And what they do is, they just end up being a little bit more casual. Over year, they lose a little bit of lean body mass because they're not as active, or they just don't work out. That losing lean body mass coupled with enjoying the holidays, coupled with like weekends, and that literally by itself explains like a lot of people's weight loss as they get older, just that by itself. So why I'm bringing that up is because when people have a set point, set points, it's their lifestyle that needs to change. And this is why it's so important that we have a period of time with your program where it's when body composition, where it's a maintenance phase. So the guy who we just showed that photo of, who's like, he's lost all this weight, we're actually going to try to get him even leaner. And we just took 3 months of slowly adding his calories back up, right? During those 3 months, it's allowed him to practice living that lifestyle, practicing that. And his weight's been really stable, right? It's not that he reached a set point. It's that we've allowed him to just practice his lifestyle in a way that's allowed him to maintain that. And now that he has this good new lifestyle, it's a habit. He's like, yeah, I work out all the time. I feel great. I do my cardio. I hit my protein. It's just what I do now. Now we're like, good, you can just follow that. Now let's move you into that next stage, push the body a little bit more, and then maintain that for a while. And that's so critical. Most people, when they do this journey, especially with body composition, they don't have planned maintenance phases or reverse diets to get them to their calories to this normal equilibrium, if that makes sense. And it gives them time to practice their lifestyle. So that kind of help out a bit, like thinking about that. So that was one of the questions that was on there. In terms of like preventing, if you're trying to gain weight, but this is another question, trying to gain weight but prevent fat loss. I mein, the answer is we literally just want to take it slow. So usually we go back to that weekly average, there's only so much muscle mass you can build. And this is actually in the notes. I just kind of scrolled through it because I wanted to go over the photos. If you're trying to gain more lean body mass, either via reverse diet or like, Matt, I feel like I'm trying to get bigger, but I want to minimize my fat, right? Because you're pretty lean right now. The goal is we want to see like an increase in your weight, but not very much. So like 1 to 2 pounds a month is literally what we're looking at. And by doing that and just training hard, and looking at making sure your protein's there, you're training hard, you're doing what you need to, and we just really go slow with it, that's really all you can do. Same thing with dieting down. When somebody's losing fat, we want to make sure, actually the guy who we had the photo of, we actually had him do a DEXA scan at the beginning and at the end. And on his DEXA scan, even though he lost 50 pounds, he ended up losing, the numbers came out to, out of 50 pounds of weight loss, 36 pounds of fat, 10 pounds of water, 4 pounds of muscle, if that makes sense, which is actually really stinking good for 50 pounds of weight loss. Like that's incredible. So that means his metabolic rate from where we took him at to where at the end was like only 60 calorie difference, which is incredible. So we did that. And once again, because you just make sure you have enough weight training in, making sure that you're slowly pushing the limit. Like I said, not crazy amounts of adding stuff in, because that when we go crazy amounts, the sink, too much water, it overflows. Enough over time to keep the sink going, let the drain expand over time, and that allows you to keep adapting and keep kind of moving forward. And then we just make sure we're looking at our measurements. Too much weight loss too fast can lead to lean body mass change, but we're probably talking, it depends on the person, but that's why we want to look at their waist circumference to make sure that we're losing fat there as their weight is dropping down overall. So that kind of makes sense to everybody. So those are kind of the big questions. Other than that, there's a bunch of other stuff, but any last minute questions from anybody on here? Cool. Do you mind if I ask? So if anybody wants to jump off, what was something they learned today that was like super valuable to them? I just want to make sure that everybody got something that was pretty helpful.
Well, you answered my question about the and everything with the reverse dieting, because I've been trying to put on some more muscle without gaining that much fat.
Yeah.
But I realized I was being a bit too aggressive with the calorie increase.
Yeah.
And that's where that was coming from. So now I know I need to be a bit more gentle and a bit more easy with it than I was being.
Yeah, and you can stretch it out. You know what I mean? Like one of the things I think that happens, and this is a chronic problem with people, is they don't let time help. We're in a rush, and we have expectations for things. Like you're talking about, like the expectation, you're like, man, I'm not getting size. I think that's when people go aggressive and they go too quick with things. But if you add like 100 calories and you wait 2 weeks and your weight doesn't go up, and then you add another 100 calories and you wait 2 weeks and your weight doesn't go up, you just keep doing that. At some point there's a break point, and then maybe it's 400 calories from now or 1,000 calories. I'm just throwing a number out there, but at some point, like, it'll go up. But as long as you're giving it that kind of 2-week stretch with like the weekly weight average and your waist circumference, you'll get to that point. It's a really helpful one. Yeah, so just take your time with it. Usually once you cap your protein out, you just want the rest of it to be like carbs and fats, if that makes sense. So anybody have anything else that really kind of got out of today?
For me, it was helpful to hear about like when you're having a like you're doing progressive overload or whatever, and you hit like that where you don't progress, to do like the deload, or have some planned ways to compensate so that you can keep going. Because I think that when I stopped and like switched over to salsa dancing, I hit one of those and didn't really take that proper time to deload and just kind of stopped altogether.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, like it's important that like as you push things forward, right, become more aggressive with it, that that like eventually that sink's going to overflow. Like it's inevitable, right? Like as we continue to push harder, that happens. So it's important that you let the sink drain now and then, and it doesn't need to be anything crazy. Like deload weeks can just be fun. Like it could just be hiking and going out in the woods and doing things you enjoy doing. It doesn't need to be like super structured how I do it. One tip on that too with the deloads is depending on how you guys are doing your workouts, I do like a 4-week like rotation. So what I mean by that is like every 4 weeks, I kind of like revamp with just new exercises, similar like structure and goals, but like just freshens it up a little bit, right? You don't have to do this by any means, but one of the things I do with my deload is when I do that new like 4-week block, I use that deload as a time to practice what I'm going to do. So like I just get an idea of like the setup, how long it's going to take me, how do I even like the exercises paired together? Because sometimes I like write it out and I'm like, oh, this is going to be great. And I kind of go practice it and I'm like, it might be weird or something, or I just don't like how they're organized together. So I use that time to kind of get an idea of what I'm going to do, try it out and be like, yeah, this is good. And then sometimes I make modifications on my first week of actual training, but that 1 week, that first week I'm just learning, I'm just kind of going through the motions. I'm trying to get a feel of it. I'm not trying to like push myself, but I'm like just getting a feel of like how the weights feel and how the workout feels in general. That's a really good way to do a deload, because you kind of kill 2 birds in one stone. Like you get a practice week and then you get your deload, which is helpful. Cool. Anybody else get anything out of today? I know there's like a million things we went over.
The sink theory was very helpful.
Yeah. When that was explained to me, that was like my mind, I was like, oh my God, that explains like stress really, really well in terms of like, and it's a dynamic situation, right? Like I know we're talking about a sink, but like both how much stress is coming in is not the same every day. Other things affect how much stress is coming in. Like when we think about stress, we're only talking about stress today as physical stress, right? But there's work stress, right? Relationship, financial, other things like our own genetic, like there's so many things going on. So that's why it's so important to be a little a little forgiving with ourselves and give yourself some grace. When there's a bunch of stuff going on in your life, there's so much coming into the sink and there's only so much you can do. You know what I mean? And that's why like, it's so important. Like pro athletes, it's their job, you know, like to train hard. But like when it's not your job, there's all these other things coming in and it's so hard to manage all those things at once. And it is important to recognize that because a plateau could just be like, once again, it could be like holidays and financial stress and all these other things. And that's impacting your body's ability to, you only have one system for recovery. Like we just have your actual like nervous system to manage and deal with all these things. So it can be pretty tricky and pretty hard. Yeah, that's really, really helpful. Other than that, if anybody doesn't have any more questions, hopefully we covered, hopefully we got something out for everybody today. One second. Sorry, somebody just dropped something off. So hopefully we covered everything for like everybody today. At least you guys got something out of it. I know we didn't really hear from Jessica, Misty, Gina, and Nicole. You guys are dark, but that's okay. You don't have to, I'm not asking you to jump on. But so hopefully everybody got something out of it today. This is Breaking Through the Plateau. A lot of really, really good stuff. If you guys have any other kind of questions on this, always let me know. And for everybody who's kind of watching or future, this will be out for most people in a little while. Other than that, let me just stop